Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to discuss something that's extremely important, perhaps more important than any medication, hormone, peptide that I prescribe, and that is when you should eat carbs and protein. Extremely important that we understand that this is most probably the single most impactful thing you can do when it comes to optimizing your health. Because ultimately, no matter what medication you're prescribed, what it does for you, if it's not in your best interest with your diet, it's not going to work. So let's go ahead and let's start the presentation and let's go through looking when you should eat carbs and protein. Okay, give it a second for the screen to share. Okay, and we are live. Wednesday, August 26th, 6:30 p.m., discussing when you should eat carbs and protein. A simple evidence-based session on when carbs work best and why spreading protein beats one giant meal in small shifts that can fit your real life. So the key thing to understand here is that whenever you take carbs, doesn't come across the same in your body. Taking carbs in the morning is very different than taking carbs in the evening, and the time differential makes all the difference. So today's simple question: can we make food work better by changing the time and duration? Timing matters. Circadian rhythm, insulin sensitivity, appetite. These are all critical things that we hear about, but we're not quite sure what they truly mean. Circadian rhythm. It's the rhythm of when you wake up, when you go to sleep. How your body responds first thing in the morning is very different than how your body responds late at night. First and foremost, insulin sensitivity is greatest in the morning, meaning if you eat carbs in the morning, your body is more able to digest it than if you eat carbs later in the day, right? So that's what we need to think about. The idea is we're not about perfecting a diet or having some unrealistic expectation for what you should do and for what you shouldn't do. Rather, what we want to do is have better carb placement and better protein distribution across the day. All right? Body response to food changes across the day. Insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning, which means that it's best to eat carbs in the day. And if you have carbs later, what happens is that your body doesn't digest it as well, and it creates what's called a postprandial stupor, meaning the carbs are not able to digest properly, so it creates a greater glucose spike because there's greater insulin resistance. All of which is to say, the earlier in the day you can eat the carbs, the better your body's going to respond to. And again, morning and daytime. Generally better to handle glucose in the morning and spread out the protein throughout the day. It's a key thing. So let's talk about that. Carbs earlier in the day are easier to manage. When you have more carbs in the morning, what happens is that there is a greater ability of insulin to handle the carb and process the digestion more effectively. 7-day diet diaries from 867 studies, 867 adults have found that morning intake was associated with lower total intake for the day. What does that mean? Front load the carbs. You'll tend to eat less because your body will then give out greater satiety signals, meaning it'll feel fuller longer throughout the day. If you take it later in the day, you won't have that benefit. What does that translate for you? If the carbs trigger the cravings, start by moving late evening carbs earlier in the day so you won't get those food craving triggers. Now, the carb default, earlier or around the day. Tests have shown that the food quality and the total intake of sleep, stress, and activity still matter. You have to make sure that you get the daily exercise that you need and that your total intake does not exceed what is the optimal caloric load for your body. If you train at night, some carbs may make sense, but you much rather work out in the morning and have carbs at the time of your workout in the morning and then focus on keeping it lighter with carbs throughout the day. One rule of thumb: Earn carbs with movement. Calm the glucose spike with protein and fiber and avoid lonely carbs, meaning the carbs that you want to take late at night. Now, protein is different. Protein has a more distributive quality, meaning there's no optimal time to take the protein. No early morning protein shake or late night protein. The best way to take the protein is by distributing it throughout the day. Every meal has what's called a leucine threshold, meaning the minimal amount of protein for your body to distribute signals throughout the body that we are in an anabolic state, that we have enough protein where we want to start building muscle. If your body doesn't have that on a per meal basis, your body starts to conserve or engage in catabolic metabolism, which means that it breaks down the muscle. So the idea is that each meal needs a certain amount of essential amino acids to build and repair. And after that switch is maximized, the excess protein doesn't really go to waste, but it doesn't necessarily signal more protein. So it's not as if taking all the protein throughout the day in one meal will give you a massive bulk. Rather, you want to have the protein thresholds meal over meal across the day. Even protein beats one giant dinner. What they found is that when it comes to the protein, it's less about the clock and more about even distribution. As you can see here, even distribution beats one single big protein. And the idea is that we're having roughly 30 grams at breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a evenly distributed manner is better than having just one massive surplus of protein at one time in the day. So how to spread the protein without thinking about it? Well, think about protein anchors. These are vegetarian-based or rapid protein absorbable compounds in which you have Greek yogurt, berries, eggs, cottage cheese, protein smoothie, or a chicken bowl, tuna salmon, and at dinner, lean meat, fish, and tofu spread throughout the day. With the idea being you're not taking too much protein at one given time, but rather having protein distributed across time over the entire day. Here's a good idea that can work for most people. In the mornings, start with protein and smart carbs. At lunch, have a balanced plate of protein, a little bit of carbs, and then in the afternoon and dinner, really de-emphasize the carbohydrates and focus on the protein throughout the day. The key here is that by having protein distributed throughout the day and front loading the carbohydrates and decreasing the carbohydrates, you put yourself in a situation where you optimize the leucine threshold on a per meal basis and optimizing the insulin sensitivity early in the day to more adequately process the carbohydrates. So this rule of thumb doesn't necessarily work for everybody, and the idea is when and how you want to optimize this. First and most obvious thing is when you can go work out. And this is why we say early morning workouts are better than late evening workouts, because your insulin sensitivity is greatest in the early day. Meaning, if you were to take a carb load after you work out, your body would have a greater insulin sensitivity to process the carbohydrates post workout. Now, of course, diabetes medications, other medications, GLP-1 use, all of these impact the timing, but they should not as much as you think. The GLP-1 medication should optimally be taken early in the morning. Workout should be done optimally early in the morning, and you should really focus on carbs after an intense workout first thing in the morning. So here's what we can do. Let's set a 7-day timing reset. Pick one carb shift that you move from late in the day to earlier in the day, and pick one protein shift that you can distribute across the day and see how that makes you feel. The goal being you're not trying to make too many significant changes. You're simply identifying when you can take carbohydrates, push it earlier in the day, when you can take protein and distribute it across the day to optimize your body's performance for that day. Now, if any of you have any questions on any of the clinical studies that we reference in here, these are the clinical studies. If you want the exact clinical studies or the papers themselves, send us an email and be more happy to share them with you.